Islam. Whoever seeks a religion other than Islam, it shall not be accepted of him, and in the hereafter he shall be of those who are lost. Many times we neglect two factors about these verses. Number one, the context. Number two, the word itself. The context. The context of these verses, both of them occur in chapter 3. And they discuss, chapter 3, Al Imran, it discusses Jews and Christians. It criticizes them for their deviations and praises them for the good. In the context of a Ahli Kitab discussion, when God is saying, I am only going to accept Islam. In fact, in one of the verses, right after this, God says in verse 3, chapter 85, chapter 3, verse 85, excuse me, God says, Inna dina indallahi al-Islam. The religion in the eyes of God is Islam, and the only reason that the people of the book differed was because of jealousy. In other words, right after saying the only religion is Islam, God criticizes Ahli Kitab. Similarly, in the verse before this, God mentions some of the deviations of the Jews and Christians. So after criticizing Jews and Christians, then God says, the only religion in the eyes of God is Islam. These verses have to be looked at the context of where they occur. Additionally, the word itself is a proper noun. The connotation that al-Islam here refers to some type of verbal submission to God actually goes against, in my humble opinion, and also in the opinion of pretty much all of the commentators of the Quran, it goes against the word form. God is not saying that the religion in the eyes of God is submission, Islaman. He is saying al-Islam, which is alif lam, which is the Islam. And that only occurs in a proper noun. You cannot have alif lam before a verb. Alif lam means it's a noun. So what is being talked about is a specific, what has been called a reified understanding of Islam. Additionally, there are many other verses which don't have it as explicit, but still have a very clear-cut message that people have to believe in the message as it exists. In chapter 2, verse 137, once again the verse is directed to Jews and Christians, and then it says, so if they believe as you have believed, then they shall be guided. But if they turn away, they are left in confusion. So it's quite clear that the context of the verses has to be taken into account. You cannot cut and paste phrases of the Quran and ignore where these phrases occur. The second category, the first was that Islam is the only acceptable religion. There are many verses there. The second category of verses that suggest a rejection of the prophethood of Muhammad, is tantamount to a rejection of God. The concept of prophecy is linked to belief and submission to God. One of the central tenets of the Quran is that belief in all the prophets of God is a fundamental precondition, or at least co-condition, with believing in God. In more than one verse, Muslims are told we don't make any distinction between the prophets. In over 50 verses, various peoples throughout history have been criticized because of rejecting the prophets. كَذَّبَ قَوْمُ نُوحٍ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. The people of Nuh rejected the prophet. The people of so-and-so rejected the prophet. In over 4 verses, God's punishment is linked to rejecting the prophet. كَذَّبُوا رُسُلِي فَكَيْفَ كَانَ وَعِيدٍ. They rejected my prophet, see how my punishment was. So in a number of verses, belief in prophethood is a key condition to accepting God and believing in Him. In yet another verse directed to the people of the book in the context of our Prophet Muhammad, in chapter 3, verse 81, there is a reference to a covenant that God took with all of the prophets, that you would believe in any prophet that comes after. لَتُؤْمِنُنَّ بِهِ وَلَتَنْصُرُنَّ. So the context here is given, you must believe in every future prophet as that prophet comes. In the 4th chapter of the Quran, once again, within the context of Ahli Kitab, there is a verse that in my opinion is one of the most crystal clear verses, and it's not just my position, it is actually, I have read over 30 tafsirs specifically in regards to these verses, and by and large the message is the same. Chapter 4, verse 150. God talks about the people of the book, and then He says, those who wish to disbelieve in God and His prophets, by trying to separate between God and His prophets, and by saying, we will believe in some prophets and reject other prophets. Now this is not a verse that applies to Hindus or Buddhists or atheists. We believe in some prophets and reject in other prophets. The Quran quite clearly says, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ حَقًّا. These are the people who have really denied. They are the real deniers. Once again in chapter 7, verse 156 to 158. Within the context of discussing a very famous Jewish story of them meeting God and the 70 chosen people. And those chosen people pray to God and they say, "Oh God, forgive us for our sins." Right after that, God says, "My mercy encompasses everything." A lot of our speakers have quoted this phrase. They kind of sort of forget the very next phrase. "Therefore I shall write it, فَسَأَكْتُبُهَا." My mercy encompasses everything, but I shall write it to those who believe and who give charity and believe in our signs, those who follow the unlettered prophet, whom they find mentioned in the Torah and the Injil and their scriptures. Whoever believes in him and supports him and aids him, they are the ones who are successful. Once again, very clear-cut verse directed to the Ahl Kitab that they must believe in the chosen prophet. And we can go on and on. Of them is chapter 4, verse 115. Whoever opposes the messenger after the guidance has been made clear to them and follows a path other than the path of the believers, we shall lead him to that which he has chosen and take him to the fire of hell. And there are many, many other verses as well. The point being, the centrality of believing in the Prophet of God is a necessary pre- or co-condition along with believing in God. The third category of verses, verses that suggest that a rejection of the Quran is a rejection of God. And again, I don't want to go into so many hundreds of verses. There are literally hundreds of verses that you must believe in this Quran as a revelation from God. The very first chapter on the second page, in verse 24, God challenges those who deny that this is a book from him. And he says, whoever doesn't believe this is a book from me, produce another chapter or another Quran like it. And if you don't do so, then your punishment will be the fire of hell. Once again, these are verses that are quite clear, quite explicit, quite numerous. Belief in the books is a precondition or a co-condition to ultimate faith in God. The fourth category of verses are verses that criticize the beliefs of other faiths. And we've mentioned quite a few of them in the last day and a half. Numerous verses in the Quran criticize the belief of the idolaters, of Christians, and of Jews. These are the three primary religious groups that the Quran came into contact with. The criticism of Arab paganism is a central thesis to most Meccan revelations. The pagans are castigated not only for their social practices, but also for heterodox and superstitious beliefs. It is not just orthodoxy, but orthopraxy that the Quran wishes for its people. The pagans are viewed as having strayed from monotheism and as having fallen into unjust social practices. As for the Ahl Kitab, the view is quite clearly expressed that the Ahl Kitab were legitimate for their time frames. They were rightly guided people, unlike the pagans. They had a book, they had a prophet, but over time they deviated, and both the Jews and Christians concealed or deviated from the true teachings of their prophet, hence the need to reveal a final message through a universal prophet. The criticism of key Christian doctrines is quite pronounced. Many times these doctrines are described by the verb kafara or the noun kufr, which is of course the antithesis of iman. The Trinity is described as kufr. Belief in Jesus as the Son of God is described as kufr. Worshipping Jesus Christ is described as shirk. And therefore it is no surprise that the Ahl Kitab are referenced in the Quran as being those who kafaru. The term kuffar or kafaru is used for Ahl Kitab in over 5 or 6 verses. Of them is 2:205. وَدَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ وَالْمُشْرِكِينَ. The people who have done kufr, both of the Ahl Kitab and the pagans, do not wish for any good to come to you. Of them is Surah Nisa verse 89, 489. وَدُّوا لَوْ تَكْفُرُونَ كَمَا كَفَرُوا. They wish that you become kafaru like they have become kafaru. So the term kufr and kuffar and kafaru is used for the pagans, and it is also used for the Ahl Kitab. Simply because God calls them Ahl Kitab doesn't mean that they are rightly guided. It simply means they are the best of those who have disbelieved. They have much in common, unlike the pagans who have less in common. And this has been the standard dominant position of Sunnis and Shiites and Mu'tazilites and other theological positions, that the Ahl Kitab are a category of kuffar and not distinct from the kuffar. And the Ahl Kitab have certain legal privileges that the non-Ahl Kitab do not have. Therefore, any interpretation of any phrases or any verses that argues for the theological acceptance of other religions must take into account the hundreds of verses that mention key critical tenets of the religion. And before we move on, I'd like to mention, of course, that I have completely sidelined the hadith literature because it is not possible